Hello and welcome back, and today I want to talk about Seagate's range of NVMe SSDs. That's right, anyone that's ever looked at upgrading their laptop, maybe a gaming PC, maybe the caching bays on a NAS, even some modern consoles, a number of these different systems are starting to include support of M.2 NVMe SSDs. These are SSDs that are a great deal smaller than traditional 2.5-inch SATA SSDs, but also provide an enormous increase in performance. However, because this technology is by no means as widespread in the knowledge of most users as traditional hard drives and SATA SSD, it can get very, very complicated comparing all of these different NVMe's on the market. And even outside of just Seagate, if you look at the entire range of M.2 SSDs out there, there's an enormous disparity in prices, capacity, performance, reliability, warranty. So to get through the mug of all of that, what we're going to be doing is concentrating on just Seagate in today's video. We're going to be covering some other brands in the other videos, and we're going to talk about their range of NVMe's, what's good about each of them, what's bad about each of them, and hopefully help you decide which best suits your own storage need. But it's worth highlighting all of these are the current gen of SSDs. Now, by that I mean that Seagate, just like any other brand of storage, indeed I say any technology really, their ranges are refreshed from time to time. And although today we are focusing on 5 very, very specific NVMe SSDs, it's worth highlighting that their range is a great deal larger than just NVMe SSDs, and indeed there have been older NVMe's along the way. And I will touch on them throughout the video, but predominantly I will be focusing on 5 SSDs. Let's get them on the screen now. So yes, there is our range of SSDs. Now, the reason I'm using the graphics here on screen is one, simply because there's going to be so much information here on screen that it's going to be just a lot easier to portray in this fashion. But two, I don't actually have all of the SSDs for today's video physically here. You've seen the 3 that I've got, and I've got another one in a system just out off shot that you can just about hear the fan off there that we're conducting for testing. But these 5 SSDs are pretty much the mainstream NVMe. So at the lower end, we've got the Barracuda Q5. There is another Barracuda known as the Barracuda 510, but that's largely end of life, and although it's a little bit out there, it's slowly being phased out. Next is the Ironwolf 510. Next up is the Firecuda 510, then you've got the Firecuda 520, and then you have the Firecuda 530 there at the end. So between all of these NVMe's, yes, they are all taking advantage of NVMe different PCIe grades. None of these are SATA M.2. It's worth highlighting that as well. We aren't covering any SATA M.2s for those that aren't aware. M.2 SSDs arrive in 2 different versions. You've got M.2 SATA, which is exactly the same in terms of performance threshold as a normal SSD, but it just uses a much more compact connector. Whereas M.2 NVMe takes advantage of PCIe lanes on the controller or motherboard of the system they are plugged into. That's why these 5 drives can hit performance benchmarks in the 4 figures, whereas traditional SSDs that use SATA can't really exceed around 550 to 560 megabytes per second. But let's talk about these SSDs. Let's talk about, kind of things they got in common and things they haven't. I will say in terms of NVMe Revisions, NVMe Revisions is kind of the protocol for how data is handled, and over the years we've seen newer, more efficient and ultimately higher performing revisions of NVMe come to the market, and all of them, with the exception of the one on the end there, the 520, the 530, all of them use NVMe version 1.3, with the one on the end utilising NVMe 1.4, the latest revision. I will highlight throughout this video, although I'm not going to touch too much on price in this video like I have in the others, I'm going to tell you straight away off the bat, things get more expensive as you go to that end of the table. Nice and simple, regardless of the capacity, regardless of the scale, regardless of the unit, it is just going to get more expensive as you go up the table. And the reasons for that are going to become abundantly clear. These 2 on the end, however, they will chop and change a bit, the Ironwolf and the Barracuda, the tiniest bit, but again, that will make sense later in the video. They all take advantage of varying controllers, although Phison largely populate all of them, with the E18, the latest controller there with the highest performance and handling of PCIe 4 that we'll talk about in a bit, there on the 530, and then it goes the E16 Phison controller, the E12 controller, the E12 controller on the Ironwolf, and on the end, I couldn't find any specifics on that controller, and there's going to be gaps in the specifications of the Barracuda Q5 that again will make a lot of sense when you realise what that Q stands for. Now, all of those different controllers handle everything from the SD RAM inside to the management of the NAND inside and how much wearing is taking place throughout it. On top of that, it also takes helps along with performance of data pushing through and how it's written, which can affect drive writes per day and terabytes written, something we'll talk about later on. But ultimately, things, unsurprisingly, get more powerful and efficient there at the other end of the table. But what's particularly intriguing about all of these drives is the layers of that NAND. Now, for those that aren't aware, the storage that arrives on any of these NVMe's arrives in the form of NAND. These are cells that exist on a little PCB there on the board. So if I bring that closer to camera, you can have a little look. There is an over-provisioned 400 gig model there, and we've got all of these NAND chips at the top there, each one of those with the areas of storage. Then on top of that, right at the end, we have got a controller and memory area there, the SD memory. So that's how these things are laid out. But that NAND is very, very important because there are different qualities of NAND. All of these, with the exception of the cheap one on the end, takes advantage of TLC, triple layered cells NAND. But they have different numbers of layers. They're vertically stacked and in 3D NAND, and the result is the more layers you have, the better performance, the better endurance, and ultimately the higher quality you can have on these SSDs. Slightly less so about endurance, but it does allow data to be spread out more evenly and therefore allows the data on the drives to be more long lasting and more enduring, and ultimately the repeat cycles of data going onto these disks, you'll have longevity in what you're doing in terms of endurance. So if we were to go to the other end of the table, the cheap end, let's going to keep calling that, because the Barracuda Q5, great for standalone system, day-to-day work stuff, but it has to be said that in terms of overall output, throughput, IOPS, everything, it's at the other end by a big degree. And that's because the NAND inside this one is QLC, quad layer cells. Now, the reason that is less good is simply that that NAND has got a lower threshold for its lifespan, and NAND wears away, and also the amount of data being packed inside it makes the performance dip significantly as well. So although we will talk about the read-write performance later on, I will highlight that the Q in that Barracuda Q5 stands for that quad layer NAND, and that pretty much impacts negatively across the rest of the disk you'll see throughout today's comparison. But the rest of them, it goes up accordingly, with 64 layer NAND inside the Iron Wolf, another 64 layer NAND in the Barracuda 510 series, hence why they both got the 510 there. But the upper two do raise things significantly, with the 520 arriving with 96 layer NAND, and quite impressively the 530 with 176 layer NAND. And again, much like inversely on the Q model, on that 530, that means ridiculous benchmarks in a number of ways that will become abundantly clear later. Last thing I'll add before we get onto the general throughput, performance, IOPS, durability and more, I will talk about PCIe revisions as well. As mentioned, all of these arrive on M.2 NVMe, and they've got slightly differing NVMe revisions. However, NVMe utilises PCIe lanes in its utilisation. Now, PCIe lanes, up until about a year and a half, 2 years ago, were pretty much all PCIe Gen 3, and the NVMe slots were PCIe Gen 3 times 4. Now, the PCIe number there, Gen 1, 2, 3 or 4, corresponds with Gen 1 being 250 megabytes per second, Gen 2 being 500 megabytes per second, Gen 3 being 1000 megabytes per second, and Gen 4 being 2000 megabytes per second. The number on the end, that's the times 1, times 2, times 3, times 4, etc. Times 3, I don't think there is a times 3. That just multiplies that number. So for example, PCIe Gen 3, which is 1000, x4 times 4 equals 4000. That is the full potential bandwidth. That's the pipe that can be worked with here. Whereas these drives and that NAND, I hate seagulls, the NAND on these cells and the controller and the DRAM and that sort all works together to try to put as much water or data through that pipe as possible. Now, the Barracuda Q5 the IronWolf 510 and the FireCuda 510 all utilise PCIe Gen 3 times 4. I'm going to ignore them. And all of those drives do a relatively good job of saturating that pipeline there. But obviously, at the greatest extent, that is on the FireCuda 510. But the FireCuda 520 and the FireCuda 530 take advantage of PCIe Gen 4 times 4. So that is a potential 8,000 megabytes per second pipeline. And these drives do a very good job of filling that. But obviously, right there at the other end of the table with that best NAND and best controller, it absolutely smashes it. So it's worth bearing in mind that if you are utilising a PC, a gaming rig, one of these bad boys here that have got different PCIe revisions, if you aren't using a PCIe lane surpassing PCIe, Gen 3, you're going to be bottlenecked to whatever that maximum is. So in real terms, you can look at a system that's got a PCIe Gen 3 times 4 M.2 slot, which up until again about a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years, every motherboard had that. So if your motherboard was made prior to that, chances are you've got an M.2 PCIe Gen 3 times 4 slot in there. If you go for those PCIe 4 drives, they're going to be bottlenecked immediately. And you're going to be wasting money on more expensive drives and not getting that true performance. So make sure you double check your PCIe lanes before you go to the trouble of opening yourself up to a giant faster drive that you may not be able to use. So now let's talk about capacity. I said I wouldn't touch on about price too much here, but I do think a lot of people will care about capacity between all of these. Now, it's worth highlighting that in terms of overall largest capacity, the FireCuda 530 arrives at 4 TB, which is really quite impressive. That enormous amount of storage. Don't get me wrong, it's not cheap, close to £1,000 in fact, but still nonetheless, it's still good to have that huge amount of capacity. However, it starts at 500 gigabytes, there's a 1 TB, a 2 TB and a 4 TB. Now, throughout the rest of the ranges, we do see some smaller capacities available, and maybe you just need an OS drive, maybe you need just a small couple of drives to run for NAS, based caching inside your system. Maybe you're just a low-level gamer, not a pro gamer, esports, or doing streaming. If you want to go for a smaller capacity, there are 250 gig drives available in the FireCuda 510 series and in the IronWolf series, although the IronWolf series is specifically designed for caching, something that will be a lot clearer later on when we start talking about the utility, IOPS, and read and write performance. Indeed, let's talk read and write performance right now. So, between all of these, there is an enormous disparity, with obviously performance getting bigger and bigger and bigger as we go up along the table. However, I will add that the IronWolf 510 is a bit of an anomaly here, and it's also as a testament to the idea that drives are designed for utility. Much like the knives, forks and spoons in a cutlery drawer, there are different knives, forks and spoons for different utilities. I've mentioned it before, you're not going to make your tea with a ladle. So throughout the rest of this comparison, do bear in mind that the IronWolf drive, the 510 there, is designed for caching in a NAS system. It is designed to work in unison with an existing hard drive array for caching. And it can be used for general storage, and it can be used for storage pools, of course, but they are primarily designed for caching, with a lot of read being prioritized over write, which is kind of the whole point of cache, where frequently accessed files will be moved with lesser frequency onto those SSDs than the files themselves being accessed by the very nature of being on there. So if we look at the read and write performance between all of them, we can go straight into the lower end there, which we're breaking it down into two figures. At the lowest tier, we can see that it's 2,300 megabytes per second read and just 900 megabytes per second write. And again, a large part of that is to do with that QLC NAND. There's a significant performance drop. And also, without knowing what that controller is, and without knowing the layering of that NAND, I think it's fairly decent to say that that is not going to blow anyone's mind. It even peaks at the highest 2 TB model at 2,400 megabytes per second over 1,800 megabytes per second. Right, which sounds all right, but I'm sure it's there on screen. Look at how that compares at the other end of the table there. At 7,000 over 3,000 read-write at the lowest 500 gig tier, and then going up to a staggering 7,300 megabytes per second over 6,900 megabytes per second write. That's dwarfing it. And yes, I said I wouldn't talk about the prices, and yes, they are very different prices. but not massively so when you start looking at 2 TB or even the 1 TB models. And although there is a premium on the 530, and yes, you're going to need to have a PCIe Gen 4 M.2 slot to take advantage of it, for that M.2 I should say, it's still very, very significant there at the other end. And although that other PCIe 4 drive there, both PCIe Gen 4x4, it's 5,000 over 2,500 at the lower end and 5,000 over 4,400 at its highest 2 TB tier. Now I said the anomaly was always going to be the Iron Wolf, because look at that performance. How weird does that look? 2,450 megs over 290 megs. What? Isn't that madness, you're thinking immediately? And that's the 240 gigabyte model. This drive even takes advantage of over provisioning the NAND inside. And over provisioning, if you're not aware, is when the drive takes advantage of a slither of the capacity to be used as a kind of buffer zone internally in conjunction with the controller and the memory inside. And much like caching inside a NAS, in fact. So that extra little slither of storage, that's why drives that use over provisioning generally arrive in really weird, quirky capacities. So rather than 500 gig, you get 480 gig. Rather than 250 gig, you get 240 gig, and so on and so forth, with the Iron Wolf 510s arriving at a maximum 1.92 terabytes, or 1,920 gigabytes there, because of the over provisioning. Even at the top end, it's 3,150 over 850 megs. Yes, it is being outperformed in terms of write activity by that quad layer NAND, but at the same time, that's because this drive is designed for caching. And if you try to use this drive in a non-caching environment where read is incredibly prioritized, you're not going to enjoy it. This drive is designed for caching. It's designed for NAS. So don't look at this drive, even if it's on offer, if you're going to try and use it in your gaming or your editing, because although you're going to be able to read from it, if you're editing 4K, 8K, anything like that, this drive is not going to back you up. You're going to stall a few times. Now, we've already looked at the performance of all of these drives, but let's talk about how that translates into IOPS. For those that aren't aware, IOPS, or input-output operations per second, this is how many things that drive, how many instructions and tasks it can be handed at any given second for it to pass through. Obviously, things get higher at the more expensive end with the IOPS there at a staggering 1 million IOPS, over 1 million at the top end. Yes, you have to get to the larger capacity, and at the lower tiers it's 400 over 700, but still, that's an enormous amount of handling on that drive. And although IOPS doesn't really apply to everyone, that's handling enormous numbers of instructions to the drive. And I think even online gamers or online professional esport players, yes, you're making lots of operations and everything's happening within the PC, but generally these games are still handled by a central server that can act as a bottleneck. But in terms of AI, that's when that IOPS really comes through and through. And of course, it's higher than all the others we can see there, 700 odd, 600 odd. And again, when we get to this end of the table, not only that cache drive, clearly prioritizing read IOPS at 270,000 over 25,000, so not even 6 digits there. But the Q drive there, the Barracuda Q5, doesn't even state reported IOPS. And again, that's because of the architecture on that drive, and this basically being a borderline, like kind of SATA architecture SSD in NVMe clothing. It does break the 4-digit megabytes per second throughput barrier, but it's not exactly wowing anyone while it's doing it. And in terms of IOPS, if you are running AI, if you are running data center class stuff, and you are looking for an SSD to back that up, or you're putting these inside U2 adapters, or U3 adapters, dare I say, with the PCIe Gen 4 stuff, definitely go to that end of the table with these three here. Now, endurance and lifespan of these drives is a very intriguing subject as well, because all of them report 1.8 million hours MTBF, and MTBF, mean time between failure, that's basically drive dies, another one up and running. It's very hard to use that as a measurement in anything. So luckily, we can utilize terabytes written or drive writes per day, which we will in a moment. But before we do that, it's worth highlighting that obviously these figures are based around predicted life cycles of these drives, and warranty periods is generally the container that the lifespan of a drive is measured by. And with all of these drives, with the exception of the Q5 there, all of these arrive with not just 5 years of manufacturer's warranty, so if it dies within 5 years, they'll back you up and send you a new one. But also they've got 3 years of data recovery services. The rescue recovery service that QNAP have done for a while. We've done testing on it before. I've smashed the drive around. We got, like, I think more than 99% of the data back. It's forensic level data recovery. And again, that will cover you not only for damage that was beyond your control, but also accidental deletion, corruption, even malware restoration, that sort of thing. Lots of these things are covered by that data recovery, and I do recommend you check out the TNC first, but it's pretty all-encompassing, to be perfectly honest. But the other end of the table, with that Q5, because of its architecture being significantly more modest than the other drives that we've seen here, the result is that Seagate have clearly reined in their support of this drive, because they are saying for consistent use, they're not prepared to give it the 5 years there, which on an SSD is very, very rare, but definitely something you see in quad-layer NAND SSDs. And this drive arrives with 3 years of manufacturer's warranty and just the 1 year data recovery services. Now, why is that? The warranty on drives isn't just about whether it's going to fry or snap or break or anything like that. SSDs have endurance, and as you use them more and more over time, it can result in two things. One, the drive will eventually the NAND will wear away. It's not like the platters inside a hard disk. It doesn't work that way. The corrosive elements of power going into these drives, these are all play a part in the read of data through them until they eventually just die and wear away. Hence why those controllers, as they get more expensive and more proficient, they also have very detailed allocated aware wear on the drive. So the NAND is being read and written to intelligently, so it can make all the NAND last as long as possible. Now, the other thing that results in is as the NAND is overused and overused and overused and write and rewrite, performance starts to dip, and it never becomes more apparent than on the quad layer NAND. I did whole videos comparing all different kinds of NAND to help you understand the terminology, and QLC NAND is very much the bottom of the barrel. It allows larger capacities, it has to be said. They can cram more in and they use less NAND for larger storage, and that was when we first started seeing 8 TB M.2 SSDs and traditional SSDs in 2.5-inch SATA thanks to QLC, but it has to be said, the performance was nightmarishly bad by comparison. I know that's dramatised, but seriously. Now, you've got the data recovery, you've got your warranty period, you know what the confines you're working within with the 5 years. Let's talk about endurance, because as mentioned, as you read from these drives consistently and write primarily, let's face it, that's the big kicker, and electricity is passed through these, the NAND, you know, they have a limitation about just how much data can be pushed through, not only throughout their lifespan, but also just generally per day. This is measured as drive writes per day, DWPD, and although lots of specification sheets will list TBW, terabytes written, which is measured either as an annual figure sometimes or within the lifespan of the drive, different brands do that a slightly different way. That's all relative to the capacity. Drive writes per day, DWPD, is a nice decimal place figure that we can look at, and it helps us understand because that applies to all the capacities. Now, these are actually quite different between all of them, with one of the few moments where the Iron Wolf drive there absolutely smashes it. Let's go with the lowest of the low. Unfortunately, we're going to go back to the Barracuda Q5 once again. Standard desktop use, office PC, that sort of thing. This drive has a 0.2 rating for drive writes per day. What that means is that you can write up to 0.2 of the overall capacity, or 20% of the capacity. So if it was a 1 TB drive, that's 200 gigabytes. You can write that much onto this drive per day in terms of its throughput and what it can do, without and still have this drive working proficiently throughout its lifespan. If you do more than that per day, then it has a potential to shorten the lifespan of the product overall. So they say you can put up to 200 gig on this every day and it will maintain its performance for that 3-year period. Now, as we go through the others and we look at their different drive writes per day, we can see straight away that the FireCuda 510 and the FireCuda 530 have both got 0.7 or 70% drive write capacity per day. So that's quite an impressive figure, and to maintain that and maintain 5-year warranty and maintain high IOPS and maintain high throughput, well done. And that fires on E16 and E18 controller respectively are what really helped that. And of course, the extra layers on that NAND do their job too. But it's the top two here. We have the FireCuda 520 arriving at 0.9 terabytes, 0.9 drive writes per day, which again, nearly the entire drive, but boom, right there on the Iron Wolf drive there is 1.0, or a full drive capacity drive writes per day supported. Now, of course, its write speed is somewhat lacking compared to all of these, with the largest capacity 1.92 terabyte hitting 850 megs. So it's going to take a wee old while to fill that up anyway, but the endurance factor of these drives, because they're going to be used for caching, and they're going to have a much more frequent data refresh, and by that I mean that new data will be applied considerably more frequently and across the whole disk than any other drive here on the table. You can see why they have prioritized the endurance and the lifespan of the Iron Wolf over all of these others, because the other four drives are going to be more likely, I hate seagulls, to maintain the data that's on them for longer periods of time. And that's why the Iron Wolf, although it has arguably more rudimentary write and slightly more impressive read, although it does pale in comparisons to the FireCudas, it's still a great drive for caching, and I think it still eclipses the Barracuda due to its endurance overall. Now, who are these drives for? As mentioned, the Barracuda Q5, that is for your standard desktop. You're not going to be, I wouldn't recommend it for gaming. You could put it in a gaming rig, but I think given a lot of modern gaming, and particularly if you've got a PCIe Gen 3 x 4 slot with a potential 4,000 megabytes per second bandwidth to fill, the Q5, I'd still say that should be for modern office work, maybe low spec gaming. Iron Wolf, obviously, for now, as the name would suggest, that we've already covered that. But the FireCuda 510, 520, 530, although these are all for gamers, I would break it down like this. The 510 is going to be good for pretty much any gamer, standard gamer. And again, although the capacities go up to 2 TB, they're quite affordable now, the 510s. And I do think the 510 for a casual gamer, or even a gamer that's going to play some FPS, some high-end Steam library stuff, but for themselves personally, it's a good drive to go. If you are a gamer that takes things a little bit more seriously, maybe you stream regularly on Twitch, maybe you're an online gamer consistently and you want to make sure latency is as low as possible and there's no bottlenecks, but you're not really doing it at an esport professional level or as a livelihood, the 520 is still a standard choice to go for. And finally, the 530 at the end is your be-all, end-all, like game winner drive. If you are a professional gamer, if you are a 4K or 8K video editor, and that goes a little bit for the FC520 as well, the end of the table there is the drive that you buy if you don't want to have to do this again for the next 5+ years. Because remember, those endurance figures don't necessarily mean that in 5 years this drive's going to be kaput. That's not what this is about. But with those endurance figures on there and that lifespan and that ability to not only endure but sustain that performance in its lifespan, unless you are going to go at it hammer and tong, this drive should sustain that performance for much longer than 5 years as well. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have found this video helpful. I know it's been a bit long, but this is a large amount of information to cover in a short space of time, and I want to make sure you guys choose the right drive. There's a guide in the description linked over to NAS Compares, so you check that out. It breaks down all of these drives into a little bit more detail. And of course, if you've enjoyed this video, click like. If you want to learn more, click subscribe. And otherwise, I will see you next time.